Very efficient.
I call Joel Chevelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank Chris Ockenvold for taking a call. It's, as I recall, the first call that he's taken in the debate.
Really 4 minutes.
And while it was a short call, there were 1 or 2 points that I think it's worth mentioning. Although I will say it's a shame that we didn't hear from the chair of the Select Committee in respect of Parts 1 and Part 2, because they are, in fact, the primary parts of the legislation. They deal with the purpose, the objective, the functions, all those matters that other members and I think the public would have liked to have heard the person responsible for chairing the Select Committee on. But nonetheless, we were denied that opportunity. Mr Ockenvold said that he was mystified, and this was his last point, by some comments made by my colleague Ruth Dyson. And I want to remind Mr Ockenvold and the committee what Ruth Dyson was talking about. She was talking about the tabling of an SOP in the committee stages which related to a Treaty of Waitangi clause. Now, sir, that was the first time that that clause had been subjected to any sort of parliamentary scrutiny. Now, the Minister's looking through his bill. It's true that that clause relates to an earlier part, but I know I'm going to be indulged because I'm responding to a matter that was dealt with in an earlier speech. What Ruth Dyson's point was that it was discourteous to the Select Committee and to the Chair to have a substantive treaty clause of that nature appearing for the first time in legislation after the Select Committee process had finished. Because what that means is that the public gets no opportunity to have any sort of input, any say or any submissions on the point. The Minister just said, what about my amendments? The difference, Minister, is all my amendments were moved in response to public submissions. They were suggested by the public, but your government decided in its wisdom or its arrogance, take your pick, not to include those amendments. So that's the difference, sir. Now I'm going to take a few moments to talk about a particular provision in Part 3 that I would like the Minister to do us the courtesy of speaking to. And that relates to Subpart 2. Subpart 2, and in particular clauses 25 through to 28, and in particular clause 27, would disestablish the Environmental Risk Management Authority, but also ngā kaihautu tikanga taio, the effective Māori Advisory Committee to the Environmental Risk Management Authority. And I see that one of the effects of a supplementary order paper, number 241 in the Minister's name, is to correct the spelling of taio in clause 28. I do hope, as I say, that given the Minister has moved a supplementary order paper that affects this part, and given that it is an important part, that we will actually hear from him on it. What I want to ask the Minister is what is the effect of the establishment of, the disestablishment of ngā kaihautu tikanga taio, particularly as by clauses 20 and those that precede it, 19, 18 and 17, we have a new Māori Advisory Committee established for the EPA itself. And if the Minister is going to address the committee on this point, how do these provisions fit with the supplementary order paper that stands in the name of Rahui Kātane, which the House has already had some discussion of, but which is entirely relevant to this part because it's the part that abolishes the Advisory Committee to URMA. And in particular, how is the new Māori Advisory Committee and how is the EPA to satisfy the new test that has been inserted into the law by the earlier supplementary order paper, where the EPA is required, quote unquote, to take appropriate account of the particular treaty clause in one of the contributing pieces of legislation to the, Mr Chairman, to the to the EPA. That is one of the environmental acts under which the EPA gains authority to act. Because as we've heard already, sir, there are different provisions in each of those treaty clauses, and the new obligation, if we pass this bill in the form that so far we appear to be likely to pass it in, is that there's a new test, take appropriate account of the Treaty of Waitangi. That's what EPA is obliged to do, but it's to do so by regard to these different treaty clauses. And my concern is that the advisory committee that's being established to replace the existing body that advises IRMA will be quite bewildered about how to do this. Why is that, sir? Well, the Resource Management Act, the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, the Climate Change Response Act, and the and the Conservation Act, which is not a bill of a piece of legislation of direct relevance to the EPA, but which will obviously have an effect on the general manner in which the EPA operates, all have different types of treaty clause. There are other functions to be discharged by the EPA under the Ozone Layer Protection Act and the Import-Exports Restriction Act, where there are no requirements to have regard to treaty clauses. And I think what's happened is people who are unfamiliar with the way in which a Crown entity works have looked at this legislation and thought, oh well, we'll put a treaty clause in and hope that it works. But it's not as if an individual staff member working in the new EPA will just have responsibility for climate change, or just have responsibility for hazardous substances and new organisms, or just for the Resource Management Act and projects of deemed national significance, or just the ozone layer, just the Import-Exports Restriction Act, or just any of the new functions that might be added to the EPA, either by the Minister's fiat or by legislation in the future. The reality is there'll be policy analysts or others who've got multiple responsibilities under all those bits of legislation. Initially they might start just working in one area, but of course if the EPA is to work, they're going to have to take an integrated approach. Not only are they going to have to be directing themselves properly on the law in respect of any individual provisions in the contributing pieces of legislation, they're going to have to reconcile these treaty clauses. And often, as I've pointed out, a treaty clause will require one thing in one piece of the EPA's responsibility, a different thing in another, and then there won't be an obligation in yet another. And finally, there's this overall obligation to take appropriate account of treaty provisions, which has now been inserted by the supplementary order paper already approved by the committee in respect of an earlier part. So my concern in respect of this particular part, sir, is how are these obligations to be reconciled? There's to be a Māori advisory committee, other committees with relevant responsibilities in the contributing organisations, particularly in IRMA, are being abolished. There's this multiplicity of tests that exists in other pieces of legislation, and there's now a new overarching test in respect of treaty obligations that has been inserted by the supplementary order paper. But there's no overall requirement as to how to act in respect of treaty matters, in respect of consultation with iwi, in respect of fulfilling a fundamental requirement, which is finding out what Māori think in respect of a particular proposal or function, and then taking into account or having regard to or having appropriate regard to use the three different tests that now already exist in respect of these functions of those considerations. So it's a fundamental matter that is raised by the subpart because of its obligation, the obligations that I've referred to, and because of the disestablishment of Ngāi Kaihautu Tikanga Taio, the replacement apparently of that body by the Māori Advisory Committee and these conflicting provisions, which I've referred to, sir, in this contribution.
I call Brendan Burns.